I thought I had left the past behind me, but when my son handed me that small, wrapped gift on my birthday, everything changed. His lingering touch, the way he looked at me, it wasn't just gratitude or love. It was something far deeper, far more forbidden. And when he leaned in to kiss my cheek that night, I felt the walls I had built begin to crumble. The morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows, casting a pale silvery glow over the kitchen. I stood by the window, cradling a warm mug of coffee, trying to soak in the quiet. Life hadn't always been this serene. Nearly 2 decades ago, my ex-husband walked out on us, leaving me to rebuild a life I thought we had crafted together. My son, Ethan, was only 6 then, with wide, innocent eyes that couldn't comprehend why his father would never return. That night, I clutched him tightly, promising myself I'd shield him from every hurt the world might throw his way. The years that followed were a blur of sacrifice. Late nights, early mornings, scrimping and saving just to make sure Ethan never felt the void that threatened to swallow us both. I poured all my energy into raising him, creating a life for us that felt whole, even when it wasn't. Now, at 23, Ethan had grown into a man I could barely recognize. Taller than me, with a quiet confidence that was uniquely his. His love for photography had blossomed from a childhood fascination with an old camera I picked up at a yard sale into a full-fledged passion. I often watched him in awe as he turned simple moments into art. His presence was grounding, a reminder of everything we had overcome. That morning, he walked into the kitchen with a boyish grin that tugged at my heart. He kissed my cheek, a warm, affectionate gesture he'd never outgrown. Standing beside me, his shoulder brushed mine as he placed his camera bag on the counter. For a fleeting moment, his touch lingered longer than usual. I shook it off, attributing the thought to my overactive mind, but there was something about the way he looked at me that morning, soft, knowing, that stayed with me. Ethan had always been my anchor, my reason to keep moving forward. As he prepared to head out into the snow to capture the world through his lens, I felt a strange pull to follow him, to step into his world. Maybe it was the stillness of the morning or the quiet connection between us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that today was going to be different. Ethan had always been a man of few words, but lately, his silences felt different. There were moments when his gaze lingered just a fraction too long, when his touch seemed more intentional than accidental. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was simply reading too much into innocent gestures. But the subtle shift in his demeanor was hard to ignore. That morning, as the snow fell softly outside, I decided to join him on one of his photography excursions. I pulled on my boots, wrapped a scarf snugly around my neck, and followed him into the crisp winter air. The world seemed impossibly quiet, the snow muffling every sound, leaving only the crunch of our boots and the rhythmic click of Ethan's camera shutter. He was in his element, pausing to capture the way the light danced across the snow-laden branches. I stood back, watching him work, marveling at the passion in his every movement. But it was the way he looked at me, soft, unspoken, that sent a strange flutter through my chest. When I stepped forward to help adjust his camera strap, his fingers brushed against mine, lingering for just a moment too long. The contact sent a warmth through me, grounding me and unsettling me all at once. As we walked through the woods, the snow falling around us like a dream, Ethan's hand occasionally found my lower back, guiding me along the path. These gestures, so small yet so deliberate, began to weigh on me. Was I imagining this? Or was there something more to the quiet moments we shared? When we reached a frozen lake, Ethan paused, his camera poised to capture the breathtaking scene. I stood beside him, my hands buried in my pockets, trying to shake the growing tension inside me. But then his hand brushed mine again, so fleeting, yet so deliberate that it stopped me in my tracks. I glanced down at our hands, then up at him, searching his expression for answers. His gaze met mine, steady and calm, as if he knew exactly what I was thinking but didn't want to say it out loud. The air between us felt charged, heavy with something I couldn't quite name. And when he leaned down to kiss my cheek, the gesture was slower this time, more deliberate. It wasn't the kiss itself that unsettled me, but the way it lingered, the way it felt like more than a simple sign of affection. By the time we returned home, I was exhausted, not from the walk, but from the thoughts swirling in my mind. Ethan set his camera down on the counter and flashed me one of his easy, boyish smiles, as if nothing had changed. But I couldn't ignore the way my heart raced every time he came close, or the way my mind replayed every fleeting touch and lingering glance. That evening, as I sat alone in the living room, Ethan walked past me, his hand grazing my shoulder in a gesture so casual yet so intimate that it left me breathless. I tried to push the thoughts away, to convince myself it was all in my head. But the truth was, I couldn't stop wondering. Was this just my imagination, or was there something between us that neither of us dared to name? The tension in the house was palpable, unspoken but undeniable. I found myself looking for signs, searching his every move for answers. And the more I noticed, the harder it became to dismiss the feeling that something was shifting between us, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. The days that followed felt like stepping into uncharted territory. Ethan's presence around the house seemed to fill every corner, his quiet confidence drawing me in like never before. I told myself it was nothing, that the lingering glances, the fleeting touches, and the warmth of his smile were all just products of my imagination. But the more I tried to dismiss these thoughts, the more they consumed me. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the house in a golden hue, Ethan was seated at the dining table, sorting through the photos from his latest outing. I leaned against the kitchen counter, sipping a cup of tea, watching him intently. The glow of his laptop illuminated his features, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the slight furrow in his brow as he focused. There was something mesmerizing about the way he worked, the intensity in his expression as he carefully curated his shots. I don't know what compelled me, but I crossed the room and placed a hand on his shoulder. He looked up, startled at first, but his expression softened almost immediately. "You have an eye for beauty, Ethan," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips that made my heart skip a beat. "You've always been my inspiration," he replied, his tone steady but laced with something deeper. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. I quickly withdrew my hand, retreating to the kitchen in an attempt to gather my thoughts. But Ethan followed, standing in the doorway, his frame filling the space and making the room feel smaller, more intimate. "Why don't you sit with me?" he asked. His voice was casual, but there was an undercurrent to it that I couldn't ignore. I hesitated but eventually relented, sitting beside him as he scrolled through the photos. Each image was more breathtaking than the last, snow-covered trees, icy reflections, and soft light filtering through the branches. But then he stopped on a photo of me, taken earlier that day. I hadn't even realized he'd captured it. In the picture, I was standing by the lake, my hands buried in my coat pockets, the snow falling gently around me. There was a softness in the shot, a vulnerability I hadn't seen in myself for years. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My breath hitched, and I turned to him, unsure of how to respond. His hand reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from my face. The touch was tender, deliberate, and it sent a shiver down my spine. "Ethan," I started, but the words caught in my throat. He was so close now, his presence overwhelming, the air between us charged with an intensity one couldn't ignore. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured, his gaze locked on mine. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The house was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the heater in the background. His hand lingered on my cheek, his thumb brushing against my skin in a way that made my heart race. I should have pulled away. I should have said something, done something to stop this. But instead, I stayed frozen in place, drawn to the warmth of his touch and the intensity in his eyes. When he leaned in, his lips brushed against my cheek. Not the quick, fleeting kiss of before, but something slower, more deliberate. My eyes fluttered shut, and for a brief moment, I let myself feel it. When I finally pulled away, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, confusion, and a strange sense of longing that I couldn't shake. Ethan said nothing, but his eyes held a depth of emotion that left me breathless. The following day, I found myself unable to focus on anything. Every glance, every word, every fleeting touch seemed to carry a weight that hadn't been there before. Ethan's presence was magnetic, drawing me in even when I tried to create distance. And the more I tried to resist, the more I found myself succumbing to the pull. That evening, we decided to have dinner together. A simple meal, nothing out of the ordinary. But as we sat across from each other, the tension between us was impossible to ignore. At one point, our hands brushed as we reached for the same dish. The contact was brief, but it sent a spark through me that I couldn't deny. Ethan noticed it too. He didn't say anything, but the way he looked at me, soft, unspoken, and filled with something I couldn't quite name, said everything. As the evening wore on, the tension only grew, each moment between us charged with an intensity that left me reeling. When he kissed my cheek again that night, the gesture lingered longer than before, his lips brushing against my skin in a way that left me breathless. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking, reading too much into these moments. But deep down I knew better. Something was changing between us, something I wasn't sure either of us could stop. The evening started like any other, but there was an unspoken weight in the air that neither Ethan nor I could ignore. I busied myself in the kitchen, trying to focus on anything other than the thoughts swirling in my mind. Ethan was in the living room, sorting through his photographs with the kind of focus that usually calmed me. But tonight, even the hum of his activity couldn't quiet the storm inside me. As I set the table for dinner, I glanced at him from across the room. His face was illuminated by the soft glow of his laptop, and for a moment he looked just like he had as a boy, wide-eyed, full of wonder. But then he glanced up, catching my gaze, and the look in his eyes wasn't that of a boy anymore. It was something deeper, something that made my breath catch and my hands tremble as I placed the plates down. Dinner was quiet at first, the silence filled only by the clink of utensils and the occasional murmur of conversation. But the tension between us was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. I avoided his eyes, focusing on my plate, but I could feel his gaze on me, steady and unyielding. Halfway through the meal, I couldn't take it anymore. I set my fork down, my appetite gone, and looked up at him. "Ethan," I started, my voice quieter than I intended. He looked at me, his expression soft but unreadable. "We need to talk." He didn't say anything at first, just leaned back in his chair and waited. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. "What's going on between us?" I finally asked, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Ethan's brow furrowed, and he let out a slow breath. "You feel it too, don't you?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His words sent a shiver through me, confirming what I had been too afraid to admit. This wasn't just in my head. It was real, and it was happening. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice shaking. This isn't right." Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table as he looked at me with an intensity that made my heart race. "Maybe it isn't," he said. "But it's there, and ignoring it isn't going to make it go away." The weight of his words settled over me, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I stood abruptly, needing to put some distance between us. I turned away, gripping the edge of the counter as I tried to steady myself. I felt him behind me before he even moved. His presence was magnetic, pulling me in even when I wanted to push him away. "Ethan, we can't," I said, my voice barely audible. But even as I said the words, I felt him step closer, his hand brushing lightly against my arm. "I'm not asking for anything," he said softly. I need you to know how I feel." His words broke something inside me. I turned to face him, my eyes searching his for some kind of answer, some kind of clarity. But all I saw was him, the boy I had raised, the man he had become, and the complicated, undeniable connection we now shared. "I don't know how we got here," I said, my voice trembling. "But this can't happen." Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he reached out, his hand cupping my cheek in a gesture so tender it brought tears to my eyes. "I don't want to lose you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I can't pretend this isn't real." Before I could respond, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was both hesitant and deeply deliberate. My mind screamed at me to stop, to pull away, but my body betrayed me. I found myself leaning into him, my hands clutching at his shirt as I gave in to the moment. The kiss was brief, but it left me breathless. When we pulled apart, the reality of what had just happened hit me like a freight train. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice cracking. "We can't do this." "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't help how I feel." I stepped back, putting space between us as I tried to process everything. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, and I felt like I was drowning in the weight of what had just happened. "I need time," I said finally, my voice shaky. "I need to figure out how to move forward." Ethan nodded, his expression a mix of heartbreak and understanding. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as my mind raced. The kiss had stirred something in me, something I couldn't ignore. But the guilt, the fear, and the overwhelming complexity of the situation made it impossible to think clearly. The next morning, Ethan was gone before I woke up, his camera bag missing from its usual spot by the door. I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment, grateful for the space but aching for his presence. As the hours passed, I found myself replaying the events of the previous night, wondering how we had gotten to this point and what it meant for the future. When Ethan returned later that evening, The tension between us was palpable. We moved around each other like two magnets, drawn together but terrified of the consequences. The unspoken feelings hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, and I knew that something had to give. It wasn't until later that night, as we sat together in the living room, that the dam finally broke. Ethan reached for my hand, his touch grounding me in a way that nothing else could. "I don't want to make things harder for you," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I need you to know that you mean everything to me." Tears filled my eyes, and I looked at him, my heart breaking under the weight of his words. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted. "I don't know how to feel anything but guilt." Ethan squeezed my hand gently, his touch warm and reassuring. "We'll figure it out," he said. "Together." For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, fear, longing, and everything in between. I tried to keep my distance from Ethan, but every time I turned a corner, he was there, his presence a constant reminder of everything that had happened. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a battleground between what I knew was right and the feelings I couldn't seem to control. Ethan, for his part, was patient. He didn't push, didn't bring up the kiss or the words we had exchanged that night. But his actions spoke louder than anything he could have said. He was always there, helping in the kitchen, fixing things around the house, or simply sitting nearby, his quiet presence both comforting and maddening. It was as though he was giving me space while reminding me that he wasn't going anywhere. One evening, after a particularly long and restless day, I found myself in the living room, staring out the window at the snow-covered yard. The world outside was calm, serene, a stark contrast to the chaos inside me. I heard Ethan's footsteps behind me, soft but deliberate, and before I could turn around, I felt his hand on my shoulder. "I can leave if that's what you need," he said softly, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "But I want you to know that I'll never stop caring about you." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. The thought of him leaving made my chest ache, but the idea of staying in this limbo felt equally unbearable. "I don't know what I need," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I just know that everything feels so complicated." Ethan moved to stand in front of me, his eyes searching mine for something. Answers, maybe, or permission to say what was on his mind. "It doesn't have to be," he said. "I know it's not easy, but we don't have to figure everything out right now. We can take it one step at a time." His words were meant to reassure me, but they only made the weight on my chest heavier. "This isn't just about us," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "What we've done, it's not something people would understand. It's not something I can even understand." Ethan's expression softened, and he reached out, brushing a tear from my cheek with a tenderness that made my heart ache. "I don't care what anyone else thinks," he said. "All I care about is you." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek despite my efforts to hold it back. "But I care," I said, my voice breaking. "I care about what this means, about what it could do to us." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was deafening, filled with all the things we wanted to say but couldn't. Finally, Ethan stepped back, his hand falling away from my shoulder. "I'll give you space," he said, his voice low but steady. "But I want you to know that I'm here if you ever need me." As he walked away, the sound of his footsteps fading down the hall, I felt a wave of emotions crash over me. Relief, sadness, and a deep, aching loneliness that I couldn't seem to shake. I wanted to call him back, to tell him that I didn't want space, that I didn't know how to navigate this without him. But the words wouldn't come, and I was left standing there, staring out at the snow as it continued to fall in lazy spirals. In the days that followed, I threw myself into anything that could distract me. Cleaning, reading, even revisiting old hobbies I hadn't touched in years. But no matter how busy I tried to keep myself, my thoughts always drifted back to Ethan. I replayed every moment we had shared, every look, every touch, every word, trying to make sense of how we had gotten here and what it all meant. Ethan, true to his word, gave me space. He stayed out of my way, his presence still quiet but less constant. I could feel the distance between us growing, and though it was what I thought I wanted, it only made the ache in my chest worse. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I found myself overwhelmed by the weight of it all. I thought about the life I had built for us, the sacrifices I had made to give Ethan the best possible future. And now, here we were, standing on the edge of something I didn't know how to define. The next morning, I found Ethan in the kitchen, a cup of coffee in his hand as he stared out the window. He turned when he heard me enter, his expression unreadable. For a moment, We just looked at each other, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. "I don't want to lose you," I said finally, my voice trembling. "But I don't know how to move forward." Ethan set his coffee down and crossed the room, stopping just a few feet away from me. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," he said. "We'll figure it out together." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that made my chest tighten. I nodded, unable to trust myself to speak, and Ethan reached out, his hand brushing mine in a gesture so fleeting yet so grounding that it brought tears to my eyes. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to feel a sliver of hope. Maybe we could find a way forward. Maybe, despite everything, we could navigate this complicated, messy, beautiful bond without losing ourselves, or each other. The days turned into weeks, and while the intensity of those first moments of discovery began to fade, the questions and emotions they had stirred remained. Ethan and I moved cautiously around each other, as though afraid to break the fragile peace we had managed to create. But something had shifted, an unspoken understanding that we were both trying to navigate this complicated, uncharted path together. One afternoon, as the snow began to melt and the first hints of spring peeked through, Ethan approached me while I was sitting on the porch, a steaming mug of tea in my hands. He sat beside me, the warmth of his presence filling the space between us. For a long time, neither of us said anything, the silence broken only by the soft chirping of birds in the distance. "I've been thinking," Ethan said finally, his voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "About everything." I looked at him, my chest tightening at the earnestness in his expression. "And?" I prompted, unsure of what I wanted or feared to hear. "I think we've both been holding on to something we don't fully understand," he said. "And maybe we never will. But I know one thing for certain. I don't want to lose the bond we have." His words hit me with a bittersweet clarity. He was right. Whatever had unfolded between us was a tangled mix of love, gratitude, and something deeper that neither of us could name. But it didn't have to define us. It didn't have to destroy the life we had built together. "I don't want to lose it either," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But we have to find a way to move forward. Together, but differently." Ethan nodded, his gaze steady and filled with an understanding that brought tears to my eyes. "I think we can," he said. "As long as we're honest with each other, and with ourselves." The days that followed were a turning point. We began to rebuild, not by ignoring what had happened, but by acknowledging it and choosing to focus on what mattered most. Our relationship had always been built on trust, support, and an unbreakable bond, and those things hadn't changed. If anything, they had grown stronger. Ethan threw himself into his photography with a renewed passion, spending long hours capturing the beauty of the changing seasons. And I found myself rediscovering parts of me that I had long forgotten. The joy of creativity, the thrill of stepping outside my comfort zone, the strength I didn't realize I still possessed. One evening, as the sun set and bathed the house in a warm, golden light, Ethan showed me a new collection of his photographs. Among them was a picture of me, taken during one of our walks in the snow. I was standing by a tree, my head tilted upward as the flakes fell around me, a soft smile on my lips. It was a simple moment, but the way Ethan had captured it made it feel extraordinary. "You've always seen the best in me," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "That's because you've always been the best part of my life," he replied, his words filled with a quiet sincerity that left me breathless. In that moment, I realized something profound. Love isn't always simple or easy to define. It's messy and complicated, and it doesn't always fit into the neat boxes we try to place it in. But it's also transformative, capable of healing wounds we didn't even know we had. As the weeks turned into months, Ethan and I found a new rhythm, a balance that allowed us to honor the connection we shared while respecting the boundaries we needed to rebuild. It wasn't always easy, but it was worth it. Because in the end, love in all its forms, whether as a parent, a child, or something more, has the power to change us, to challenge us, and to remind us of what truly matters. What would you do if faced with a love so complicated, it defied everything you thought you knew? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more heart-stopping stories that will leave you questioning everything. And trust me, the next story? It's one you won't want to miss. Stay tuned.